Hello, my name is Bill Scheidler. I'm part of the Apostolic Leadership Team for Ministers Fellowship International, and I'm here today to talk to you about everybody's most exciting subject, that is local church government and the church constitution. Oftentimes this is a important but neglected document in the church. It's tedious, it's detailed, it's nothing people really enjoy. It's more like the business side of the church. We would rather focus on the spiritual side of the church, but yet sometimes underneath of it all, we are snagged, if you will, by the small things having to do with the way we operate. But it's not the fun stuff which we all enjoy, not so inspirational, which we all enjoy. But many, I've found, pastors don't even really have an idea about what the state of their constitution is in. I've been to many churches to help them during times of difficulty, and one of the first things I ask for is the constitution of the church. And usually they start their apology tour at that point in time and talk about, well, we don't really follow our constitution. I'm not even sure I know where a copy is. I was in one situation, in fact, where they did some searching and they finally found in an old file somewhere a kind of a yellowed copy of the Constitution that has some chicken scratching on it, like this. Someday we're going to revise this, but and they're in no way following it, and so they don't see that as being something that's important or vital. And yet one of the things you'll learn over time is that some of these documents, which we really don't refer to that much, and people probably are even oblivious to a lot of them, they actually become very important at certain times, especially during times of difficulty. But rather than being embarrassed about our bylaws, we hopefully can get to a place where we're proud of them and are not afraid to show them to people and let them read them and help them understand a little bit more about how our church functions. I'm not going to be able to answer all of your questions during this video, but perhaps I can give you a framework and some idea of the things that you need to be thinking through in order to have a good working set of bylaws, a good constitution that, again, you can be proud of. You might wonder, did the early church have a constitution and bylaws? Or where in the Bible does it say that we should have one? The answer to the first question, the early church did not have a constitution as far as we know, and bylaws. And there's no place in the Bible where it tells us that we need to have them. They didn't have them because they weren't offered tax exemption from the state or opportunity to register as a nonprofit corporation in the society in which they lived. Rome was not that friendly to the church. If we didn't care about tax exemption, we wouldn't probably need one either, but in exchange for our tax status, we've been willing to accept the terms laid out by the government. However, in doing so, we have to a great degree agreed to submit ourselves to government scrutiny. There may come a time when the government uses the tax-exempt status as a way to silence the church and restrict its ability to preach the truth. It's already happening in certain places. I know in Canada, for instance, there are certain passages of the Bible you can't read, or it's deemed as hate speech. Well, again, their tax status is dependent upon their willingness to cooperate with the government. And so there may come a time when the government puts a lot of pressure on us to give that up. When that day comes, obviously there will be a lot of things that we have to reevaluate. Perhaps we have to look at the Constitution and bylaws as a necessary evil at this point in time in the world in which we live. But it is important to have a church constitution and bylaws regardless of the day in which we're living. The Constitution is a document in which we define ourselves and our mission to the state. We have a certain amount of liberty on how it is written, as long as it includes certain things that are really important to the government. And a lot of that has to do with certain restrictions on how it's governed, how the money is used, and a few other things as well. The Constitution can also serve the local church in the sense that it can give leaders a chance to look ahead and plan ahead, to know how to handle situations as they arise in the church, because they have like a roadmap already thought through. Like, how do you bring in new elders, or how do you if you had to remove an elder, how would you do that? Or how do you deal with the role of the senior pastor if the pastor has a moral failure or some other such thing, which we hope never happens. But during those difficult times, it's nice to have a document that's been pre-prepared and everybody's agreed to follow that can guide us through those difficult times. There is something to remember here, and that is that constitutions are not necessarily built for times of peace. They're built for times of war. I've seen idealistic people try to build a constitution based on what they perceive to be, well, we're going to believe for unanimity, we're going to believe for unity, and so they have these various votes where they have to be unanimous. Well, a constitution is not built for times of peace. Anything works during times of peace. But you got to understand, when the church is going through difficulty, there are going to be sides. There are going to be people who take one position or another, and it's important to have a reasonable set of bylaws so that we can actually continue to go forward regardless of the situation. So it's important to, before we even look at the Constitution itself, it's important to talk a little bit about local church government to be sure that we actually have a biblical form of church government. Because sometimes churches today are not really structured the way the church was in the New Testament. And so we've got to take a little bit of a look at that to see whether or not we actually have a biblical form of government. We do have a responsibility to meet the demands of the state, but at the same time, as Christians, there is a responsibility for us to meet the demands of the Bible. After all, the church belongs to Jesus. He's the head of the church, and he wants to have something to say about how we function as a church. So before we talk about the demands that the government places upon us, let's talk about having a church government that's based on a New Testament biblical pattern. I know there are some people who say, well, there's no real pattern for government in the New Testament. If you read the New Testament, study the book of Acts, and go all the way through the epistles, you'll realize that there is really just one form of government that God has espoused. The church belongs to Christ. He's the head of the church, and he has a sound plan for how the church is to operate. The church is not a business, and so it doesn't really function like a business per se. However, we do need to operate on sound financial principles and good judgment. The church is a spiritual organism where God wants to be at the helm. He's shown this even throughout history in every structure that he has ever commanded to be built. Every structure that God ever asked to be built, which includes things like the Ark of Noah, the Tabernacle of Moses, the Tabernacle or Temple of Solomon, and go on into the New Testament church. Every building that God ever commanded to be built, he provided the pattern. And he provided the pattern because he's the only one that knows ultimately what will work. He knows what the future holds. And so when it came to, for instance, the building of the ark, he wasn't going to leave it up to Noah and his mind and his 3 sons to get together and brainstorm, and the rest of the family to chip in their 2 cents worth to decide what was going to work, because it had to work the first time. And the early church is much the same way. We can't just leave it up to the mind of man to formulate the best kind of plan he can formulate to bring the church through to that place where it will be a glorious church without spot or wrinkle, but also an overcoming church that the gates of hell will not prevail against. Jesus is the only one that can build that kind of a church. And so God didn't set out to build a church that was going to be strong against the forces of darkness and put it into the hands of man and say, come up with your best plan, come up with your best idea. And everybody can kind of do what they like to do or want to do in order to touch this. You remember, you're touching the bride of Christ. I think he has something to say when it comes to that pattern. So he has provided the pattern for the church. And God identifies those who govern his house, those who govern the church, as a plurality of elders with a chief or lead or senior elder, whatever you want to term that person. It's plurality with headship, equality with headship. There are many forms of government that God could have chosen. He's not totally unaware of various forms of government. He could have chosen dictatorship. Now, if you know anything about dictatorship, it's really one-man rule. And this is the kind of government that is very, very simple. We have a theocracy, and I'm Theo. And so Theo makes all the decisions. Now, they may disguise theocracy by having other family members as elders or whatever they call their leaders, trustees. But at the same time, it's really a family-run, a singular person-run church. And again, decisions can be made very, very quickly, but the church cannot be built on one person because the church is only as strong as that person is strong. And there's not one person in the face of the earth today who doesn't have some difficulty, some problem, some flaw. And it's going to be in the multitude of counsels that there will be safety. There needs to be checks and balances to ensure that the church stays on track. Sometimes churches fall into this because it's tedious to get a group of people on the same page to flow together, but at the end of the day, it's going to be well worth it. Some people God could have chosen would be democracy. For some people, this is like the highest form of government. Democracy, I can get a group of people. The democracy is best defined as a rule by the people. And that sounds really good to us because we have favored democracy by virtue of our culture. We talk about democracy a lot, even though our government really is a constitutional republic. But we sort of feel like the majority should rule, and that should be able to make a decision, whether you're talking about abortion or whatever you might be talking about. The reality is the majority is not always right. And here's the reason for that. For instance, take a church. Let's take a church that's growing, like the church should grow. Let's say a church grew. Everybody in the church reproduced themselves once every 4 years. That is, every 4 years, somebody in the church brought somebody else to the Lord. That doesn't sound like a real big revival, but very few churches actually achieve that. But let's just say that was happening. We're living in days of revival, and that means that at any point you look at that church, over 50% of the people in that church are new Christians or new believers. That is less than 2 years. So the swing vote in a democracy is really the new members and the new converts, not the seasoned old warriors who have been through many, many battles and come out the other side. Actually, the Laodicean church was kind of a experiment in rule by the people, if you will. And it's not hard to understand why that church ended up being lukewarm, because new converts are not necessarily the ones who are going to accept the big challenges to go forward and to make the hard decisions. And so it actually becomes not just a rule by the people, but a rule by the immature. And so democracy was not God's plan, and God really never put any of his plan up for a vote of the people. The third form of government that God could have chosen is external control, and that is sometimes referred to as denominationalism, where some body outside of the local church really legislates to all the churches under that particular name or covering how that should function. And they may have elders and so forth, but ultimately the ultimate figure in that church is the central government outside of the local church. And one of the ways in which they can control local churches is by owning their properties, by holding their ordination papers, and by having a central mission board where each church is kind of beholden to that denomination. In many cases, they will move people around in the denomination to one church to another for pastoral leadership and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's not the local congregation that's making the decisions about local affairs. It's really an outside board that is one size fits all, which isn't always the best form of government. The fourth form of government that God could have chosen is a deacon board, or sometimes referred to as a trustee board. And this is a board-run church that is run by people that are elected by the congregation to serve in that capacity. Some may be for just a short term, it may be a rotating term, it may be much longer than that, but at any rate, oftentimes people that are more popular can get into place. People that with money can sometimes get into place, And oftentimes it has nothing to do with their spiritual qualifications for the office. It has to do more with politics in the church and other kinds of things of that nature. The question is whether or not these people who serve in that capacity have actually proven themselves by their life and their lifestyle that they hear from God and they're not just good at, say, business. I believe there are plenty of ways that we can ensure that we have good business people giving input into the decisions that the leaders of the church make, but that's not who should be calling the shots based on some business prowess that they have. God didn't choose any of these forms of government. God did choose elders as his form of government. And that translates into what we talked about before. On the one hand, there's a plurality. That is, there's many elders. As you go through the New Testament and read about the churches, you'll find that Paul didn't just put one elder in, he put many elders in. And it was always used in the plural, the elders that rule well, joint elders in every city. It was always in the plural. There was never one elder over a church. It was always a group of elders who seemingly were the highest authority in any given local church. And yet in the midst of that, there's also, I believe, the pattern for one of those elders to serve as the senior elder, if you will, the lead elder, the senior pastor, whatever term you want to apply. You can use any you want to, chief among equals, whatever term you apply, it means the same thing. Within the plurality, there's also this issue of headship. I think in the Jerusalem church, it's clear that James, the brother of the Lord, who was not one of the 12 apostles, there were 2 apostles named James, but James, who became head of the Jerusalem church, or the lead pastor, I would say, of the Jerusalem church, was actually one of Jesus' natural brothers who wrote the book of James. And you can tell when he wrote the book of James that he was a pastor because of the subject matter that he deals with in that, which are very, very practical, down-to-earth issues. But if you look at the book of Acts particularly and see how James functioned among them, for instance, when Peter was in prison and the angel set him free and he went to the prayer meeting to report, he says, "Go tell these things to James and the brethren." Why did he want to report to James what had just taken place? He sensed an accountability to James because James was the lead pastor or lead elder of the church. The same thing happened in Acts chapter 15 when Paul and Silas came to Jerusalem for the little gathering there to talk about the coming in of the Gentiles, and they had collected an offering from the various churches. When Paul brought the offering to Jerusalem, what does it say? It says that he went to James and all the elders were present. Why was he bringing that offering to James and the rest of the elders were present? Later on in that same chapter, Acts 15, we have them meeting to discuss what we're going to do with the Gentiles who receive the faith and come to the Lord. And in that process, they all share their opinions. This is a great example of an elders meeting in the New Testament. They put the issue on the table. They discuss it. People give various testimonies of their own experience and their viewpoints. Paul shares from his perspective. Different ones share from their perspective. Peter shares from his perspective. And then when everybody became silent, which is unusual for most elders' meetings, everybody became silent, James chimed in and said, "To this the scriptures agree. Therefore my judgment, therefore my sentence actually is to do this, and everybody agreed." What gave James the right to kind of summarize the discussion? Peter said this, Paul and Barnabas reported this, or Paul and Silas reported this, and therefore, and the scripture bears witness to that, therefore I'm recommending we do this. And everybody kind of chimed in and agreed to that course of action. Well, that's because of James' role in the church, and that's one reason why we have James writing the letter that he wrote instead of maybe one of the other elders or somebody else. But at any rate, we see the same thing really in relationship to Jesus as he talked to the 7 churches of Asia in Revelation chapter 1-3, where he sends a letter to the angelos of the church. Well, angelos is a word for angel, yes, but it also is a word for messenger and can be used either way. So when talking about the messenger of the church, when Paul wrote to churches, who did he address? Well, he probably sent the letter to a specific person to be read to the whole congregation. And as you read some of his epistles, you get the idea that at times he seems to be talking to the whole congregation, and at other times he seems to be talking to a singular person. And in one book particularly, he identifies the person, he says, my true yoke fellow. Well, I imagine that when Paul started these churches, that leader of the church became a genuine yoke fellow with him as he was establishing that church, and probably the one that he turned it over to. So this seems to be the pattern, not just in church government in the New Testament, but this has been God's form of government all the way from the beginning. It starts out in the Godhead. We have plurality and headship. We have plurality, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But in that we have headship. The Father sent the Son sent the Spirit bears witness to the Son bears witness to the Father, and the Bible says that God is the head of Christ. And so there is headship within that order, even though there's equality. We know there's equality of person. The same would be true in the family. We have plurality of leadership with husband and wife, and yet there's an equality there. And yet at the same time, equality of person, if you will, but at the same time, there is an order of headship. The man is the head of the woman in that sense. Not every man the head of every woman, but the husband is the head of his wife in that order of things. That doesn't mean that headship has to be dictatorial or any other thing, but there is a sense of order there, that there needs to be, as Dick Iverson used to say, someone who drives the bus. Well, we see the same thing in Israel. When God established Israel, God encouraged Moses to set aside elders, and when he did, it was Moses and the elders who took that people through the wilderness and on into the promised land. We see the same thing in the synagogue. The synagogue was set up much after like the same order, and so when Jesus came to the synagogues in the New Testament, there was usually a group of elders, the elders of the synagogue, the rulers of the synagogue, but there was usually a chief elder who was part of that. In fact, when we see Paul in Acts chapter 18 go to Corinth, we see that one of the people that got saved under his ministry was Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue. And he was called the chief ruler of the synagogue, and he followed Paul to start his new church right next door. And so whether that's ethical or not, I don't know, but I think he probably was following the instructions of the Holy Spirit. But nonetheless, the order in the synagogue was very similar to this. And then, of course, this carries over into the New Testament church. And so you have, in the Godhead, you have plurality and yet headship with the Father. In the family, you have two parents, but yet you have headship with the husband. In Israel, you had the 70 elders, but you had headship with Moses. In the synagogue, you had elders or rulers, and then you had the chief ruler of the synagogue. And in the church, you have elders, and then you also have a chief elder. Now, that doesn't mean it's a magnanimous personality that overshadows the elders in a stupendous way, but there is a focal point. There is someone that kind of leads for the sake of the congregation and others, so they know who to look to, who's the spokesperson for the eldership, who we identify that way. Now, let's get to the place where we were before. Well, how does this form of government differ in any way from the others? Well, the way this form of government differs from other forms of government is that God has also given us instructions, very clear instructions, about who is able to function in that capacity. And so God gives very specific qualifications for the office of the elder, if you want to refer to it that way, in the New Testament. 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1 are very common and familiar to us, where the qualifications for elders, or those that would be in this spiritual leadership position, are clearly given. And really it's these qualifications that make the distinction between all of the forms of government, and it's important that we follow these qualifications, because ultimately those are the things that protect us, those are the things that ensure the fact that Christ can really be the head of the church, and he can really lead and guide the church. So if we look at what the New Testament says regarding these qualifications for the office, we see that there are they could all fall in about four different categories. The first one being that they must be people with proven character. I didn't say proven characters, I said they need to be people with proven character. That is, they have allowed the work of sanctification to take place in their lives to the point where they manifest the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. They are living as good, solid Christians, mature believers. They are walking in obedience to the Holy Spirit in their daily lives. Secondly, they need to be people who have spiritual vision. That is, they have a vision to see God's purposes established, and they have the maturity to make sacrifices in the present to make those purposes come to pass. And not everybody is able to do that. Some people have a very short range vision, but God's leaders need to have people that have a vision as they walk into the future together. Number 3, they need to be people who have their homes in order. That is, they have demonstrated their ability to rule and provide pastoral covering for the church by virtue of the fact that they have established the kingdom of God in their own homes. Their own home is a reflection of the kind of leadership they will probably bring into the church. Actually, the leadership in the family is so similar and so parallel to the leadership in the church that this becomes the proving ground to make sure that those who do serve in that capacity are actually able to lead people to Christ. And then the 4th area that are covered by these qualifications is they must be people with spiritual gifting for this ministry. There are certain of the qualifications that are all about character, and we can't pass those by. There's qualifications regarding the family, and we can't pass those by. There are qualifications about maybe vision and the ability to walk out vision. But there's also this issue of gifting and ability. So also there's qualifications having to do with able to convince with sound doctrine, able to teach, able to do certain things. These leaders are not just decision makers in the church. Actually, when you look at the job description for elders in the New Testament, there's 3 basic categories. One is governing or ruling. The second one is shepherding or pastoring. And the third one is teaching or instructing. And so that should be the main function of the elders, apart from them sitting in meetings and making decisions relative to the entire congregation. So these qualifications in the New Testament are not that different from the ones that were in the Old Testament for the elders that served under Moses. In fact, in Exodus 18:21, God's leaders were to be able men, such as feared God, men of truth, hating covetousness. I'd like to recommend a couple of books for you on this area of church government. First of all, one of them is Team Ministry by Dick Iverson. This is a book that he put out quite a few years ago where he talks about ministry as a team, an eldership team, and how that team can work together, how it works in relationship to the senior role, how it works in relationship to the rest of the elders in the congregation, and what their attitude should be toward that. And then I'd also like to recommend a book of my own called The Local Church Today. And in that book, we talk a lot about how the place of the church in God's plan, how God sees the church, how the pattern for the church and how God wants it to be built. The pattern for church government talks about the various 5-fold ministries: apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher, and gives definition of them, including appointed servants in the church. And that will give you a good glimpse into what MFI would be teaching regarding church government and how the church fits into God's overall plan. Now I'm going to transition here to an actual constitution and talk to you a little bit about constitution and give you some general guidelines in relationship to them, and then I'm going to talk to you about a sample that you can download along with this video. But the general guideline for when building a constitution is to keep it as simple as possible. Some of the constitutions you look at there, well, if you get a denominational constitution, bylaws, you get a book usually 200 pages long, and in fine print and legal language and all these things which nobody really has ever read, but they assent to it just because they're tired of scrolling down, and they just check the box, I accept. But the reality is that they don't need to be that complicated. Remember, there are only certain things that the government requires. Pretty much everything else that we do, we can control through the minutes of the church and the meetings of the elders. And if we keep accurate minutes of the decisions that are made, we don't have to include everything in our bylaws that we do. We don't have to include how many services we have, what time those services are, how many programs that we have going, whether we have couples retreats or this or that or the other. We don't have to describe those things. We just have to stick with the skeleton or the basics, and because constitutions are not that easy to change, and yet churches go through various seasons where this is more important than that, or they decide to start this and then bag that, and you don't want to have to be changing your constitution every time there's a change in the programming. So keep it as simple as possible. Don't say more than you have to, and don't say so much that it puts you in a box that makes it difficult for you to function in the future without going through some major process to change your bylaws. You certainly don't need to define every committee and every program, and you don't need to put out your full doctrinal statement. We'll talk about that here in a minute as I walk through the bylaws or Constitution itself. So I want to do that. I have a set of bylaws here. I'll just show it to you. You can't read that. But it says Constitution for anywhere USA, for the local church. And what this has, it has a preamble, which is very customary. It has the name of the church and the classification of the church. Article 2 is the purposes and powers, and a lot of these things are what the government wants to see. And usually in your articles of incorporation, they ask you to describe your purposes and powers. And of course, you want to make those as broad as you can, so that if you ever decided, let's say you wanted to start a Christian school or something, and it wasn't in your bylaws, you might have to go through a struggle. But if in your original articles of incorporation, you had all these things actually listed as potential things that you could do, then it makes it much easier for you to add those things later on, whether you actually have them now or not. And so they're going to want to know that what is the purpose for this corporation and so forth. And then the third article on this one is restrictions. And some of these things are for the sake of the government again. And then one of them here is personal gain. We have to be obviously showing that we're not directly giving, the organization is not for the purpose of personal gain. It's not for the purpose of political involvement and other activities like that. That doesn't mean that people in the church can't be involved in all kinds of things, and that doesn't mean that elders can't work on staff at the church, but they're not going to be paid for being a director. They're going to be paid for some other kind of a thing. Then on Article 4, in this one, it goes through faith. And again, on this one, I have about 17 statements of faith. And everyone could say so much more, or you wouldn't even have to say that much. But the whole purpose of this is not to, this is for the government, is not to impress everybody with your 66 planks or whatever it might be. It's to establish yourself as pretty much evangelical as a church would be, with your basic doctrines very similar to what you'd find in any evangelical church. And you could put a unique one in if you wanted to, but again, the government doesn't care as much about this. Sometimes it's good to include this because some of your people will pick this up too from time to time, or there may be people who read it because they want to find out a little bit more about your church, and at least this way you can establish that you are pretty much orthodox in your viewpoints. The next article is Article 5, which is definitions. One of the things that's cumbersome in looking at bylaws is the legal terms that are continually used, and as a believer, you're constantly translating, well, how does that relate to the Bible? We talk about board of directors. Well, how does that relate to the biblical concept of elders? Or we talk about president, or we talk about this and that and the other. Well, in this particular section, I define some terms. For instance, church. The term church, as it is used henceforth in this document, is the equivalent of the legal term religious corporation. So we don't have to keep using corporate language throughout the document. We've defined these terms now, so now we can use the local church instead of the word religious corporation or elder. We don't have to use the word director anymore. We define it here as an elder is one of the directors, or the eldership is the board of directors, or senior pastor is the chairman of the board, or so forth. So you got quorum defined there, and other types of definitions that will help guide you then through the rest of the material. Then there's a article on eldership, and it talks about the selection, the qualifications, the term of office, the removal, senior pastor section, same types of stuff. What are the duties of the senior pastor? How are they appointed? What happens if they resign? What happens if they need to be removed? How are they to be replaced? All of these kinds of decisions that you don't want to be making on the spot. You want to have a plan. You want to have a track to run on when you get into these difficult times. Hopefully you never do. Hopefully these never come up to the place where there's any kind of disagreement. But the reality is they do. The next article is on officers, how they are added and removed, what their terms of office are, what their duties are. Then there's an article on membership. And in this particular set of bylaws, the membership of a church members do have a voice in some of the decisions that are being made. Now, I say voice, I don't mean they can take the initiative in the sense that they can put a motion on the table to do this or that. The elders govern. If they have something that they want the elders to consider, then they just give their ideas to the elders and they will discuss it. But when certain decisions are made by the elders, this set of bylaws allows the congregation to have a voice on some of those things. For instance, if you're going to put in a brand new elder, well, we have provision in here for the congregation to give what we call confirmational vote. And that confirmational vote, by the way, is described in our definitions. But a confirmational vote simply means this, that the elders decide this is the candidate we want to put before you as an elder. We want you to confirm this decision by 50% of the members saying yes. Now, believe me, if you had put forth the name of an elder and even 10% of the people said no, you'd want to look into that and find out what's wrong there. But it does give them a voice, that is, who's going to be over them. And one of the reasons for the confirmation vote on some of these things is that in the New Testament, there were times when you read through there, it said it seemed good to us and to the people. Well, how is there ever an opportunity for the people to express their approval? Certainly they aren't the one putting the name on the table. They aren't nominating somebody to be an elder. That is done within the eldership, and it's clearly defined in the Constitution. But they should have a right to yay or nay it. The same would be true of a senior pastor. If a new senior pastor is coming in, they should have the right to yay or nay it. And hopefully you've all heard from God, and when you ask them to pray and fast and seek the Lord, it will be the direction of the Lord, and that won't be a problem. There's other issues as well that are included in that, which would include amending the Constitution and bylaws. That's one reason why you want to be careful about this, because it's not going to be easy to change the bylaws. You want to make sure you've thought them through carefully. I put that in there for a couple of reasons. One is that there are some churches that have only 3 elders. And that's the basic minimum for a corporation in many states. Now, the government would like to see 5 elders, but even then, if you get a couple elders on a bad day, and they have all authority to make all decisions about everything, you can get a couple of guys that go a little bit haywire, and they could end up doing damage. They could sell the property and distribute it to themselves by virtue of claiming that it's all back wages or whatever. So it's more of a check and a balance, again, to an eldership, especially small elderships, that 1 or 2 people could have a major sway in how the outcome. And so that's why, in order to change the Constitution, you've got to have a confirmation vote of the people. There are some constitutions where just the board of directors makes all the decisions and that's the end of it. Well, again, there needs to be some protection there. There's also a provision in here for the sale of the main property. It was the people's money that went into it. They should have something to say about how that, if it is ever put up for sale, and they should agree with the process. When years ago in Bible Temple days, when we were down on Gleason Street in Portland, we had just built a new building, and God said, you're going to have to move again. And we ended up buying a former Bible college campus, and we ended up selling the property that the people had put their sweat, blood, and tears into, and to move up to that property and build a new auditorium. But in the process, the people had to be engaged. The people had to feel it because they were going to have to pay again for the new property. And so we did put it up for a vote to the congregation that they would confirm the decision of the elders to sell the property and then move to that new facility. So these are some of the provisions. The Article 10 in this one, well, under the membership, it included receiving new members, removing members, and those kinds of things. Reporting meeting, Article 10, a reporting meeting, an annual meeting where you kind of give a report to the congregation. It's not a business meeting per se, but at least a report of what happened this last year and some of the challenges that we face in the year ahead. How you call a special meeting. Sale of the building, that's in here. Amendments to the bylaws, that's in here. And then the dissolution of the corporation is in here. Now, there's one other article that I sometimes recommend for larger churches, and that is to have an article which I am going to be including in the material that will be on the website. And that is an article on a stewardship committee. Now, for churches that are very small, they don't even have enough people to put all these committees together. But as a church gets larger, the handling of finances and so forth can be quite a big deal. In fact, when you're dealing with millions of dollars, it's nice to have input from business people, other people who have prowess in the area of finances. And so to put together a stewardship committee that would be made up of a number of people in the church who have the best interests of the church in mind, but also have technical skill and understanding in the realm of finances and money. And that doesn't mean that they make decisions, but they can be a board of counsel to the eldership when the elders are having to make a decision about some of the affairs of the church. Before we sign off for today, let me just give you a couple of final suggestions when it comes to the bylaws of the church. First of all, keep it current. When I go to a church and they tell me, well, this is our constitution, and I say, do you follow it? Well, not really. In other words, our churches tend to evolve over time, and we get new understanding, fresh understanding. This is why I say don't put too much in your bylaws, that it restricts you from being able to move in the future a certain way that God is telling you to move. You have to have the flexibility to be able to follow the voice of the Holy Spirit, but at the same time, the government will want to know that you're actually living it. Because if you ever got into a problem with the government, and I hope you never do, but if you did, the first thing they would ask for when they came through the door, they would ask you for your bylaws and they would ask you for your official minutes. And they would make all of their decisions based on what's in those documents. And they need to see a paper trail to all these major decisions that were made relative to who's an elder and who's not. I worked with one church one time where they were going to do something with their property, and they were going to sell it and get a different property. And when it came time to sell it, somebody sued the church, and the government ended up having to come in this lawsuit. They asked them for their bylaws and minutes and stuff, and they come to find out that the real elders of the church didn't even go to the church anymore because they had left over time, but they'd never officially been resigned. They'd never officially been removed, and the new elders were not officially in the minutes added in and so forth. So by the time it was over, you had people in court making decisions in a church they didn't even go to. and it didn't work out very, very well, as you can imagine. So let's work on keeping it current. We're actually practicing what we have there written down. And then the other one, like I said, is follow it. Keep accurate corporate minutes of major decisions, and that's going to be very important. And for a lot of people, that's tedious, but at the same time, it's also a protection for the church that you have all these major decisions. You don't have to follow Robert's Rule of Order, but you do need probably some firsts and seconds and official motions and official vote recorded. And if you're like us, they mostly all turn out unanimous anyway. And if you don't like your Constitution, well, change it. You can change all of it or part of it. Sometimes it's just a little tweaking that you need to do, and you can just make an amendment or two. But if you have a really obsolete Constitution and bylaws that hasn't really been followed for years, you're best off just to construct an entirely new one and make one motion to substitute the new one for the old one, which is something that can be done, except you have to follow the processes in the old one to change the new one. So if it requires the people to be able to see this and vote on it, then you have to distribute those to everybody so they can compare them and have an opportunity to give their input. One of the things I do recommend at the end, when you're finally done with putting your bylaws together, that you ask a local attorney who's familiar with this kind of thing to look it over and give you some input. And this is only for the purpose of making sure that what you have in that is legal, not that the attorney agrees with everything that's in there. I have found that attorneys will try to talk you into some things that from a biblical point of view or from your conviction point of view, you're not prepared to do. For one, they'll try to talk you out of having any members in the church who have any voice at all. And they'll just say the members of your church are the board. So if your board is 5 or board is 10, then that's how many members you have, and those are the only ones that have members' rights. We don't do that because we do believe that the members of a congregation are important. They should have a voice, and that they should have a buy-in to what's going on. They would suggest those things because they want to make it as clean as possible, and that's not your goal. Your goal is to be as biblical as possible, at the same time satisfy the requirements of the government. So have them look it over just to make sure, because states sometimes vary a little bit. Not much, I've found over the years. They're pretty much all cut from the same cloth. But it'd be good for you to have somebody check it out just before you put the final stamp on it and then file that with the government. They aren't going to tell you one way or another. They aren't probably going to read it. They aren't going to look at it unless there's ever a problem. Then they'll pull it out and start looking at it and make a fuss over it. But in the meantime, if you have other questions, you can call the MFI office. We'd be always happy to help you through whatever things that you're going through. That's why we're here. We're here to serve you. We're here to share with each other the things that we've learned over the years from our own experience. So God bless you. I hope you have a great day, and I hope you were really inspired by this whole message on church government and the Constitution. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Hope to see you at the conferences. God bless.